We're going to talk about leveraging low and no code automation to enable teams. Just so you know, I do have LinkedIn. I'm Jenna Charlton on LinkedIn. I am not great about using it. My preference is Twitter. And I'm much more responsive on Twitter unless I'm specifically expecting to get like some sort of thing on LinkedIn, or if it like sends me a push on my phone, then I'll respond. But if you have a question for me, if you want to get me, grab me on Twitter. I'm They Wrestle Test on Twitter. So a little bit about me. I have been in testing for a little over a decade now. I've actually lost track. It's probably more like 11 or 12 years, but I'd have to go back and look and see when my official start date was in testing to tell you for sure. I am now a product owner for a company called Functionize. And it's interesting because Functionize is an automation tool. We are using AI to do some automation. We're going to talk about all of that kind of stuff in a bit. But it's interesting because moving over to the product side, specifically in the testing space, I get to bring what I know about what testers need and value and what enhances testing, and now build tools for testers. So for me, this is a dream job because, as I've mentioned a couple of times, my heart is for new folks into the testing space. I love manual testing. I love automation from it enhances what I do kind of perspective. So now I get to bring in all of that to what I do at Functionize. And it's really cool and very neat. And I will always consider myself a tester no matter how long I'm in product. I do use they, them pronouns. Not a big deal, but if you tweet at me, that's what I use. I think you've probably already seen this. I'm a cat parent. There are two of them. They show up sometimes. So if they barge in, that's just what cats do. I love pro wrestling. I love punk rock. And I am really into web accessibility. That's kind of my other thing in the technology space. I care deeply about ensuring that computing in general and the web and applications are accessible to disabled users. And that's partly because that's really an expression of empathy. And that's partly because I'm ADHD. So I want to make sure that I'm included in the things that I build. Oh, and by the way, one day I said testing is my jam and it stuck. So that's a little sticker that if we were together in person, I would give you. And if you ever see me at a conference in person, let me know and I will be sure to give you a sticker. So there are some very specific challenges that we're seeing as teams either look to shift to move to including automation in their testing strategy, or teams that have automation in place but are struggling with it. And these current challenges are things like time crunch. We find ourselves in a situation where it takes time to get this stuff working. If you are going to do traditional automation where you are using a framework and building automated tests through a coding language tied into your application, it takes time to get that stood up. It takes time to build all of that. It takes time to maintain it. Same thing, if you're bringing in a tool from a vendor, it still takes time to do this. But here's the thing, just because it takes time doesn't mean that we necessarily shouldn't do it. But we do have to acknowledge that's a challenge that teams are facing, that automation does take time. There's also the cost involved. And you may say, well, there's free tools out there. And there are, but nothing's actually free. Let's just be honest about that. There is no such thing as free. Even if it's open source and you're not paying for it, there's still a cost involved in getting it stood up for your application. There's a cost involved in maintaining it. There's a cost involved in learning it. Same thing. If you go out and buy a tool, there's a cost involved in buying it. There's time involved in getting everybody trained and learning how to use it and doing all of the kind of troubleshooting that you have to do as you integrate that tool into your practices. Then we also have this issue of skill gaps. There is no team that is fully ready to shift to automation if they don't have any automation in place. And let's be upfront, there are gaps in everyone's knowledge. There is no such thing as a 10x programmer. There is no such thing as a 10x tester. Don't mean to offend you if you consider yourself one, but we can't be experts at everything. It's just not possible. We all are going to have something that we don't know, something that we need to learn, something that we're not good at. I've mentioned that like I can code, but you really don't want me to. I'm not good at it. It takes me a long time and I don't particularly care for doing it. It's just not what my brain likes. My brain likes to do other things. So for me, if I was told that, hey, tomorrow we're going Selenium, I might have a gap there that we have to overcome. So that's a big challenge. And there's all sorts of different skill gap challenges that we see in teams. And this really is what will prevent some organizations from shifting to using automation or will prevent organizations from maintaining the automation they have in place. And then finally, one of the biggest challenges, and this is specifically as folks are looking to bring in automation, is decision paralysis. There are so many choices at this point. There are dozens, more than dozens, probably hundreds at this point of tools that you can buy. There are dozens of open source tools that you can bring in. You can build your own framework. All of these options require a proof of concept, which is going to take time. It's going to cost money. You're going to have to learn how to use them. So all of these challenges play into this decision paralysis. And we can find ourselves in a situation where we just can't decide what the right answer is. So all of these are the big challenges we're facing right now. Now, when we think about these big challenges that teams are facing, and a lot of these, by the way, especially when we think about things like decision paralysis and cost, are things that are coming from the management level. Managers have to think about how much budget do I have? What can I reasonably ask for to be able to get this going? So our potential solutions, when we think about kind of this decision paralysis, the cost, the time, the skill gaps, is to do nothing, just maintain in the status quo, potentially begin an automation project. Now, keep in mind, if I say begin an automation project, because automation is software. If we are bringing in an automation framework, we are starting a software engineering project. So this is not just, well, tomorrow we're going to start using Selenium. No, tomorrow we are going to start the software engineering project of bringing in Selenium. And we are going to then need to maintain that software engineering project of using Selenium. Paul, and I always mispronounce his last name, but Paul Grafazzi talks about this in his talk, Extra Automation Declared Software, where he's very upfront that we need to draw a distinction here, that automation is a software development project and we need to treat it as such. And then finally, our last option is to use a low or no code solution. And there's still things that we need to consider when we think about one of these low or no code solutions. For the most part, these are tools that you need to buy. So there's a cost involved. There's still going to be a time investment involved in getting them stood up. So we've got potential upsides for all of these. Doing nothing is comfortable. Change is hard. I'm not going to say that taking the easy route is a good thing, but we do need to keep in mind, we need to look at the upside that doing nothing does mean that we stay comfortable. Not changing is easy. When we think about starting an automation project, actually bringing in some sort of automation framework, building those tests ourselves, this is a long-term scalable solution. Potentially, it's going to upskill our team because we're going to have to provide some training, especially if we're talking about teams that are primarily manual. If we've got folks who have been doing technical manual testing for their entire careers, or we have teams that are primarily juniors or early career, we're going to have to train. And that may mean bringing in a boot camp to do some training. That may mean asking folks to study on their own. So we're going to upskill our team. That is a huge upside. And this is scalable. We own it. We can maintain it. And then when we think about bringing in a low or no code solution, this, again, long-term scalable solution. For the most part, they're scalable. And it's going to upskill the team organically. Now, you may say, well, if you're bringing in a low code or no code solution, what are people going to learn? They're not going to upskill. But really they are, because a lot of these tools have some learning built in. They're going to help you shift to doing some coding. Most of them have some API exploration tools in them. A lot of them require you to start doing some DevOps work and learn how to work in a tool chain. You're going to learn some networking. So there are some skills that folks are going to gain from using one of these kinds of tools. Plus, this is new software for them. Every time you integrate new software into what you're doing, you're going to learn some new things. And then we've got our downsides. Well, doing nothing will probably lead to failure in the end. If we are doing all of our testing manually, if all of this is being done exclusively manually by people, we don't have space to grow because all of that regression is done manually. That's a ton of time that we're asking for. That doesn't leave bandwidth in our team to do anything else. This means that we're missing all of the really important things, like relationships between stories, like thinking about how the testing interacts with the new stories that are coming in. We're going to miss opportunities to do things like be involved in pull requests and code reviews. We're going to miss the opportunity to do training. So while doing nothing is comfortable, doing nothing also leads to the end of things and will probably in the long term lead to failure. When we think about bringing in an automation project, this takes time, money, skills, and maintenance. Do we have the time? Do we have the expertise? Do we have the people to do that maintenance, to learn the skills? Do we have the budget to actually make this happen? And then when we think about the low and no code solutions, there are potentially technology limitations. There is no such thing as the perfect tool. Every single tool you consider, both open source and a low code, no code solution, or another tool owned by a vendor that's a more traditional automation solution, this is going to have a limitation no matter what. And even if you build something in-house, you're going to have limitations. So that potential is there. This does cost money. In the end, if you're working with a team that's been primarily manual, it might actually be cheaper than starting an automation project and upskilling everybody to doing coding. But there isn't a way to tell that up front. It's going to depend on what your team looks like. There is no one size fits all. There is no one answer fits all. But it's important to keep this in mind. There's still cost here, no matter what the solution is. And we have to consider that. And by the way, doing nothing, there's a cost associated with that too. And I'm not just talking about the cost of failure. I'm also talking about the cost of losing customers. I'm talking about the cost of rework because there is a cost to quality. That's a whole nother conversation. I could talk for 40 minutes just on the cost of quality. But keep in mind that doing nothing isn't just eventually you're not going to be able to grow any further. It's also going to, in the long term, have a cost associated. Okay, so we've talked about the upsides and downsides. Now let's talk about why some organizations are going to go this direction. Some of the reasons are things like speed to launch. You are really going to get ready to do this faster using a low or no code solution. If we're talking about an organization that doesn't have the skills in place already to build an automation tool or to build their own automation framework. That being said, what I'm finding when I talk to some of our customers is that we have organizations that have really, really highly skilled software developers and test that still choose to go with a solution like ours. And they do that because they're able to now have somebody on the business side create their tests. They can integrate BDD kind of behaviors and get this moving really quickly. So there is a speed to launch here that's really helpful. Now, my experience may not match with other tools. I've only been with the organization for, I think it's 2 months now. So I'm still getting the lay of the land on what other organizations are seeing, but this is what I'm seeing in my day-to-day. So there's a speed to launch here, and we're seeing it both with traditional SDETs and with teams that are primarily manual because there's some benefits there. In many cases, these tools wind up being more affordable than going with a traditional software engineering project to build automation. The reason it's more affordable is that people are expensive. This is not me saying that we shouldn't have automation engineers, by the way. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that if you are kind of at a cap on headcount, you can't bring in the people you need to get this off the ground, it will cost you less to go with a solution like this. And by the way, you may choose to do both. You may choose to bring Selenium in and bring in a tool like this. This is also going to help you bridge the gap. If we have a knowledge gap, if we have a skill gap on our team, our folks are primarily SMEs, they are experts in our software, they are experts in our business, they're experts in our industry. They're not experts in coding. They're not experts in automation. They may not be testing experts. They may be experts on the business side. We've got this gap here. A low or no code solution can help bridge that. It can be kind of the break down the barrier that we have between the developers and the folks who are doing the testing. Now, my hope is if you have folks who are primarily business experts, they don't have that testing expertise, we can teach people all of that great testing expertise. And I say that as an example of that. I came from the business side when I first got into testing. I learned testing on the job, and I learned it through doing it, and I learned it through training, and I learned it through taking part in conferences. So we can bridge that gap, but this is kind of those early planks between the two sides so that we can start bridging it and give people time to do that organic upskilling. And then finally, you're gaining expertise. When you bring in a tool like this, you are bringing in a bunch of experts who have done this before. They know how it works. They can help you get started. And in many cases, they're really going to kind of jumpstart you and help you make that transition. So you don't have to do it on your own like you would if you do a traditional automation project. So I want to talk a little bit about how all of this low code, no code stuff started. I hope that there's some people who remember Selenium record and playback. I will be honest, we were past really doing this when I joined testing. And I'll be honest, I didn't even realize that tools existed until my second job. My first job, it was exclusively manual. I was kind of held to running test cases and doing some exploring. I didn't really know what was happening outside of this very narrow scope that I was in. When I got to my second job, I heard that there was this happening. I think we had really moved past it, but my second job, they were a little less technical. So there were still some folks doing this for their own testing within the organization. So we know that there were some things with this early record and playback stuff, right? The tests were flaky. Anytime your UI changed, you had to re-record the test. It took a long time to do this. It was really easy to accidentally break your tests. This was not a great solution, but it was an option. And it was really where all of the tools that I'm going to talk about came from. They were all inspired by this. They all took things from this. So this is how it started, and this is how it's going. So this is an inexhaustive list of some of the options that are out there to do some amount of low code, no code. Some of these tools have more advanced features. Some of them don't use record and playback, but almost all of them do. And there's more than this. This was just what I could fit on the slide and have it not look like a mess. But there are definitely more out there. And what I've done is I've taken this giant list of tools and I've kind of broken it down into 3 categories. So our 3 categories here are AI-driven, primarily selector-driven with potentially some AI. And then I have one thing down here in visual only. And I'm going to start with that visual only. So visual only is Applitools. By the way, I'm a big fan. I think they do really cool things. Applitools is an AI-driven tool, but it does only one thing, which is visual comparison. So if you remember to Svetlana's talk, where she talked about using AI to compare the visual on the front end, that's exactly what Applitools is doing. They're doing that kind of comparison using the exact same technology that Svetlana talked about. And they do it very, very well. And this will work for you if all you need is that visual comparison or visual inspection. But for many organizations, we got to go deeper. Or there are organizations who have all of that automation, all of that traditional automation through framework already in place. They're using Selenium, they're using something else. Maybe they're using Cypress, but they need that visual inspection to enhance. They may go Applitools in their pipeline because they've got all of the other stuff already in place. Then we've got tools that are primarily selector driven. SmartBear has a tool like this. I think they're using some amount of AI. Same thing with Microfocus. Same thing with Tricentis. I think a tool is called Tosca. Eggplant is doing some of this. They were recently acquired, and I've forgotten the name of who they who they merged with, but they're doing some of this. Same thing with Sauce Labs. Sauce Labs does a lot of other stuff too. And then there's LeapWork, who is exclusively using selectors as opposed to having some amount of AI driven. So all of these are using probably something in the XPath or a JS selector or something like that to do some amount of record and playback based automation. Many organizations are choosing something like this because it's less brittle and less flaky and less fragile than the old school Selenium record and playback. They can have business analysts, product owners who are maybe not at a point where they can do something like use Cucumber. They can have business users. They can have folks like that record tests and build those into the pipeline. I've talked to a couple of people over the period of the conference about how it's value that we're looking to deliver, not code coverage, not other things. And what matters is what the user or the customer values. These kinds of options that I mentioned here with the selector-based tools, the tests that they create are primarily based around what delivers value. You can do end-to-end, you can do things like that, but they are going to take a little bit more maintenance than the tools above them in the AI-driven. So in the AI-driven side, we've got tools like Functionize that I work for, tools like Testum, Test.ai, Mabel, TestRigger, there's more. But these tools are using AI to do the selecting work. So instead of having to identify the XPath, the JS selector, something like that, it's using AI to identify what an image is, what a link is, what a button is, where it is on the page. And there's some other things that we're going to get out of this too, things like self-healing that I'm going to expand on in just a minute. There is no one answer. I've mentioned that a couple times. There are lots of choices, and the one you go with is what really fits best within what you're doing. One of the great things here, though, regardless of whichever you choose, excuse me, is that every single one of these can fit into your pipeline. So it's no longer having to have a manual tester go in and click a button to run a bunch of tests. These are going to fit into your CI/CD pipeline. You're going to run a build. Your other tools are going to run. Then you're going to go ahead and run this. Jenkins, for the most part, can kick this stuff off. But really, when you think about all of those tools that I showed you, with the exception of one of them, there is at least some amount of AI driving them. So the future really in these kinds of tools, in automation, in this perspective, is AI. This is where we're moving. But I have a big but that goes along with the future is AI. And here's what it is. AI cannot replace all of the benefits you get from a tester like me. AI can't think, feel, rationalize, experience something like a user. What AI can do is identify whether something's on the page, identify whether it moved, identify the selectors, identify some other things, help you do some analysis. But you still need a person who can experience your application. You still need to know what it feels like for a user. So I'm really clear that we want to move all of that testing that doesn't have a high impact, the testing that's regression oriented, the tests that are simply running the acceptance criteria, into our automation tools, potentially into a tool that's AI driven. And we want to have those fantastic manual testers that are business experts, that understand usability, that understand accessibility, that know what our users value. We want to have them doing all of the important work. And there's one other thing I want to mention here, and I'm going to get off topic for just a second. I mentioned this yesterday. We had a conversation about empathy in tech and what we use things like facial recognition for. We talked about facial recognition. I mentioned a talk that was really impactful to me about the ethics of software development. The future is AI in this perspective, but there is a place for artificial intelligence. There's a place for machine learning. And in my perspective, this is where it is. I don't think that it should be our future in the way we analyze people, in doing things like facial recognition. I don't think it should be the future in that perspective. It's the future in how we test things. It's maybe the future in how we do some amount of development, But for me, that's the end of where I think it should live. So I just want to point that out because I don't want somebody to hear the future is AI and think, well, Jenna said that this is the future, because I think it's the future with a caveat. All right, so back to what we were talking about. So what's the benefit of using a tool like this, using something that's primarily AI driven? Well, we've got the benefit of image comparison that I mentioned. What was it like before change? What is it like now? Do they still match? We've got the benefit of self-healing, and self-healing is probably one of the biggest things that you're going to get out of this. So original record and playback, really flaky, your UI changes, you got to re-record the test. Now we have AI and machine learning to go ahead and fix those tests for you. Within a certain tolerance, they're going to say, ooh, this changed. Okay, let me think about this change. Let me compare it to other changes. This is okay. This change that was made is okay. This is often something that we see if somebody changes the label on a button, which is common, by the way, if we're talking about things like e-commerce. We've got sales for the holidays. We may change the label on the button from get coupon code to get today's best deal. It's the same button. We just changed the label. And it's okay. And there are ways that it's going to learn and it's going to accept a tolerance of error to say, oh yeah, same button, just new label today. And then we're also going to reduce the time spent in doing things like test maintenance. And test maintenance is what's really critical. I hope I am, but I know I'm not the only person who has worked in an organization where every test goes red after a build and nobody pays attention. And you say, well, wait a minute, all the tests failed. And they're like, yeah, but the build was successful. Like, well, the build wasn't really successful because all the tests failed. And they say, no, the tests always fail. We just ignore that. So all of a sudden, we've gone from having value in our automation. It delivers something to us. It tells us something. It's our canary in a coal mine. Pardon me. To, yeah, we just don't pay attention to that. And my next question is always, well, why don't you fix the tests? Well, we don't have time. Why don't we have time? Well, we got all this other stuff to do. So all of that maintenance to the tests themselves gets ignored, gets pushed off, and then the tests stop delivering value. And here's the other thing. All of these tools are software. There is no such thing as perfect software. So there's also defects in our frameworks, in the tools that we use, and there's maintenance that's involved in that. Now, if we are buying a tool from a vendor, that maintenance isn't our problem. But if we are building something ourselves, if we are using open source, those defects are our problem, and we're going to have to find solutions to them. But when we don't have time to do things like test maintenance, we don't wind up doing that solutioning. So these are some benefits that we get out of an AI-based automation tool. Our teams are busy. Our automation teams are busy. Our manual teams are busy. That's one of the big reasons that we go to a tool like this. The things that our teams are doing, they're doing analysis of the stories, they're doing test design, they're identifying the right test to run, they're looking at traceability that I talked about a little bit here and there. They're running tests, they're doing reporting, they're running regression tests, they're in sprint planning, they're planning tests, they're identifying where the coverage gaps are, and they're dealing with things like test debt. All of these other things, analysis, design, execution, reporting, regression, planning, all of this stuff is super visible. So these are all of the things that get the time. These are all of the things that our teams pay attention to. It's the test debt that we wind up ignoring. And by the way, that test maintenance stuff that I talked about, that's test debt. Just like we have technical debt of defects that are trailing along behind the sprint, they're building and building in the backlog, our test debt is basically the same. But this stuff doesn't have visibility. This stuff isn't what your product owner values. And I say that as a product owner. This isn't something that they value. So we don't focus on it. We don't get it done. Test debt is what's ultimately going to drive us down. Test debt is what ultimately leads to a place where we're no longer delivering value. Test debt are things like not handling the defects in the framework that I mentioned, things like lagging automation. We know we need to get these additional tests built. We know that these tests deliver value, but we're so busy doing other testing work, especially when we talk about teams who are doing both manual and automation, that we can't get to keeping automation up to date with our development. Something I want to point out about that is that I always joke that there's a snowball that we build in automation. And if you've never seen like a snowball roll downhill, I want to try and make this really visible for you. When we're working with automation and we're building tests, no matter what we do, we're going to be a touch behind automation or a touch behind development. There is a certain amount of they have to build something for us to be able to identify how we're going to build a test for it. So we're always going to be just a touch behind them. Automation is kind of like a snowball rolling downhill. If we are keeping pace with it, it won't get out of control. We can maintain it. But if that snowball is rolling downhill and we stop and we do something else, we're focused on a different thing, that snowball keeps going. It's not going to stop. And it's getting bigger. It's picking up more snow. It's getting larger and larger and larger. And we're trying to catch it. But as it gets larger, it gets faster. And as we need to close that gap, we're never going to be able to move as fast as it is. So we were here and we were okay because we were keeping pace. But now we're trying, but that snowball is getting further and further down the hill and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're never going to be able to catch up. This is, by the way, why some organizations say, well, we're so behind in automation, we're going to bring in some contractors to get us caught up because that snowball got away from them. So lagging automation becomes test debt. We've got other things like testability issues, not paying attention to version control in the tools that we use. This is really important in open source. Then we stop paying attention to traceability. That becomes test debt. And by the way, just like that snowball rolling downhill in automation gets away from us, so does traceability. Once you stop focusing on traceability, you can't catch up with it because you have to figure out which stories go with which tests, and you're too far away from them to remember. We've got things like risk analysis not being maintained, not keeping up to date with it, and the big risk, which is missing the relationships between stories. This is, in my opinion, the biggest issue that we see in test debt. Those relationships between stories are the relationships between what we've already built and what's coming in. And those defects from what we already built and what's coming in my opinion, are the most critical. These are the ones that leave us in a situation where we have to refactor the whole application. These are the ones that leave us in a situation where we wind up on the cover of the New York Times because I'm going to use an example from a big bank. They had homeowners that were supposed to have been in a HARP program and they got missed because there was a relationship between stories and they got foreclosed on because there was a gap there and nobody saw it. So people lost their homes because everybody missed this relationship between stories because they were too busy doing other things. I believe that automation and manual testing are partners. You'll never replace the humans. You'll never replace the humans that do manual testing. They're critical. We need automation. It's critical to enable the humans doing manual testing to do the important things like the relationships between stories, like identifying testability issues, like maintaining risk analysis and traceability. But when we let test debt get out of hand, we don't get to all this stuff that's really important for the humans to do. So that's really why these tools enable especially manual teams. That's why they're the quick start. That's why a lot of folks are going to them. This is the first time I've given this talk. So I was really excited to take a lot of kind of new things that I've been learning and new ideas and stuff that I hadn't really spent a whole lot of time thinking about and put it together into something meaningful to kind of share it with everybody. So I know it's a lot of concepts at one time, but I hope it gives you some new things to think about in regards to what tool do you choose, what tool works for you, why would we choose certain tools over others, and what should we really spend time focusing on and thinking about as far as adding value in our testing and in the way our teams work together.